The Principal Cause of Death. Author Mark Richard Zubero. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator Eric Ost. For Michael in learning the meaning of friendship. Acknowledgements. For their invaluable assistance, I wish to thank Mike Kushner, Peg Panzer, Rick Paul, and Kathy Pekasarid. Chapter 7. Casually, I reached behind me for one of the candles. I held the flame an inch from Bluefield's chin and saw fear in the kid's eyes. That made me feel good. Bluefield gulped. You wouldn't torture me? Scott grabbed a mass of curls and yanked the head back and forth and pulled the kid's face an inch from his own. You bullied enough people, and we're here in a perfect spot to get revenge for every single one of them. I'd never heard the tone Scott used, anger and towering hatred. I put the candle down, got up, and paced in front of the two of them. Let's see if we can't get a little information, I said. Maybe he'll tell us enough if he's real cooperative. We could let him go. I picked up the candle again and held it near Bluefield's face. I saw fear and maybe anger in it, but I detected defiance underneath. Threats and intimidation from his neighbors and their protectors. Might have worked in junior high, but the kid was older and tougher now. Tell us about the drug shipment, I said, putting the candle back on the table. Bluefield swore, then spat at me. Scott's fist flicked out. Blood spurted from Bluefield's nose. Scott grabbed the kid's curls, yanked his head back, and twisted the fistful of hair until tears streamed down Bluefield's cheeks. The kid moaned in agony. Please stop, he whispered. Scott placed his lips an inch from Bluefield's ear. You've fucked around with your last victim, you scummy little coward. Scott's tone even had me a little scared. We're faggots and we're going to get revenge. Bluefield began to cry. Scott stared at the 18-year-old for a minute, then stood up and walked to the edge of the light. He kept his back to us. I could see him trembling. I turned back to Bluefield. He sobbed uncontrollably, eventually mixing words with his blubbering. Don't hurt me, he repeated over and over. At one point, he choked on his own tears and snot. Coughing violently, it took nearly 10 minutes for him to get himself under control. I left him to pull himself together. I walked over to Scott. I murmured, You okay? He shrugged his shoulders slightly and moved out of the light to the edge of the clearing, where he sat with his back against a tree. Moonlight shone on the right side of his face. I saw the glitter of tears. I turned back to Bluefield. Except for an occasional sniffle, he had himself under control. Taking out my hanky, I sat next to him and wiped snot, tears, and blood from his face. I didn't untie him. I wasn't taking any chances. I held the hanky so he could blow his nose. Several minutes and a few snuffles later, I said, Dan, I need you to tell me all about the drugs. And he did. Today, he and his dad had gone to their distributor in Chicago with a couple of friends. Dan had left with a buddy while his dad stayed in the city. They'd come out here to party. They knew of a little used, unchained entrance to the Forest Preserve. It was only a dirt road and not kept in repair, but that made it all the better for teenagers since discovery was highly unlikely. He told me about the drug operation, adding details about the dealing at school, about how deliveries were made, about where the stash was hidden in the house, so the police could never find it. When they searched, when he finished, he drew a deep breath and looked at me and said, I'm really messed up. Why did you burn my house? I asked. Huh? He said. I didn't. The alarm scared me off last night. I was at home. I didn't do it. Mr. Mason. He began to cry softly. I looked toward Scott. He hadn't moved from the tree. The moonlight had shifted. His face was now in shadow, but I could see his hands quietly resting in his lap. Let's take you home, I said to Bluefield. Scott slowly rose to his feet and joined us. I couldn't read his face in the flickering light. I listened to the now murmuring snuffles of the teenager. I heard the movement of Scott's body, felt the occasional breath of wind. Dan accepted our offer of a ride. We worked it out. The Porsche didn't have a back seat. Scott would go back to the road, take the Porsche to my place, and come back with my truck. Bluefield gave him directions to the secret entrance. While we waited, Bluefield hung his head in silence and barely made any movement. I untied him, but he didn't try to run away. I gave him my hanky so he could clean himself up. A half hour later, I heard the rumble of an engine. Moments later, Scott stepped into the light. We drove with Bluefield between us. The boy didn't say a word. I looked at Scott in the light from the dashboard. His blank expression worried me. In the truck, I asked Dan about his relationship with Jones. Dan said, "He was a joke. They all were. You were the only one who didn't buy my change. I've done more illegal stuff in the past couple months than in the past 4 years, combined." Jones played like he was my big buddy, always wanted to do me a favor, always wanted to talk over everything. He'd talk and be reasonable, and all I had to do was look sincere. Then I'd laugh behind his back, but he was easy to get along with. He never punished me, so I let him be. "Did you kill him?" I asked. "No," Dan said. "Did you see anybody that day after school? Did you go in to talk to him?" He said he hadn't. He'd come back to talk to Donna Dalrymple from the gas station at the corner of LaGrange Road and 191st Street. I called the River's Edge police station. Neither Daniels nor Johnson was on duty. I convinced the guy at the other end of the phone to call one of them at home and have them call the payphone back. A few minutes later, Daniels returned the call. I explained what Dan had told us and where they could find the drugs in the Bluefield house. I told them we'd meet them there. We arrived before any of the police. Dan simply opened the door and walked in. Mr. and Mrs. Bluefield sat on a couch in the living room, watching television. All the furniture was new and in prime condition. The television set measured 54 inches. The rug was deep and almost sensuous. They jumped at our entrance. Mrs. Bluefield rushed over to Dan. She was a thin woman with hair and a frizz that looked like it had been done by the Wicked Witch of the West. She wore a fringed and beaded deerskin shirt and pants with day-glow red moccasins. Dan stood stoically while his mom fussed at him. His dad rushed at us. He shouted, threatened, and told us to leave. I said to him, "Aren't you concerned about Dan?" He glanced at his son. "Kid's a mess. What else is new? I want you and your fruitcake buddy." He looked at Scott closely for the first time. The silence drew the attention of Dan and Mrs. Bluefield. Mr. Bluefield walked up to Scott. "You're Scott Carpenter, the baseball player." Scott asked, "Did you burn down our house?" Mr. Bluefield laughed and sneered. I wasn't ready to beat up another homophobic creep. Scott just looked tired. I asked, "Did you kill Robert Jones?" Mr. Bluefield swung toward me and raised his fist. He shouted, "Faggot's got no right to ask questions." The doorbell rang. We all looked at each other. Mr. Bluefield finally moved to answer it. We heard Johnson's voice. Bluefield slammed the door and didn't let him in. He rushed into the living room. "Cops," he said to his wife, forgetting us and their son. The two instantly sprang into action. They weren't quite quick enough. Scott dashed to the doorway that led to the rest of the house. Bluefield and wife advanced on him. Scott crossed his arms in the doorway, his blue eyes radiating cruel ice. The Bluefields hesitated. I heard the cops pounding on the door. I came up behind the Bluefields. "It's over," I said. Bluefield launched himself at Scott. He never got halfway there. I tackled him none too gently. We used his own belt to secure him to one of the living room chairs. Half an hour later, the cops hustled the Bluefields away. Mr. Bluefield had accused us of numerous crimes, but the discovery of the hidden stash silenced him. Turned out the entire ceiling in the bathroom was fake, held down by spring locks controlled by innocuous little buttons in the kitchen. Johnson and Daniels talked to us in the living room. Daniels said, "They made a lot of accusations. You're real lucky. We've been trying to bust them for a long time." Johnson said, "The kid was awful quiet and subdued. Looked kind of a mess, too. You guys do something to him?" We gave minimal answers and little information. They didn't press the issue. The police had the biggest drug haul in River's Edge history to deal with. Plus, they weren't that fond of the kid in the first place. We parted tight-lipped with the cops warning that they were watching us. Scott drove the truck back to the city. We didn't speak until we were in the garage under his building. He shut off the engine and dropped the keys into my hand, but he didn't move to get out. He slumped in the seat, spread his legs wide, crossed his arms over his chest, rested his head against the back cushion, and closed his eyes. He spoke without opening them. I guess I lost it. I just hated him so much, and I wanted to hurt him. Listening to him describe how he put that stuff on your desk and not caring how it affected you." He opened his eyes and stared out the window at the lines of parked cars. "Dan Bluefield can bring out that kind of reaction in people," I said. His hands reached out to grip the steering wheel. "The rush was incredible. I could have ripped his hair out from the roots. I don't know what kept me from banging his head to a pulp. I enjoyed it. I was glad I hit him. Now I feel awful like you the other day." I put my hand on his arm. He looked at me. "I guess I really know how you felt the other night," he said. We're going to be okay, I said. I thought revenge was supposed to feel better than this, he said. We didn't say much to each other that night. We worked out for over an hour on the machines, Scott still being careful of his pitching arm. Me of my wound from Bluefield's knife. He showered first. After I finished, I found him in the electronics room with all the lights off, watching Casablanca. The movie was at the scene where they arrest Peter Lorre and Humphrey Bogart does nothing to help him. Scott made room for me on the couch. He murmured, I wanted to lose myself in somebody else's problems for a little while. We settled into our movie-watching position, pillows propped behind us, legs sprawled on the coffee table, leaning against each other. Usually we have a bowl of popcorn between us, but neither of us was in the mood. I let my mind wander among the characters in the Moroccan desert. For a few minutes I forgot my own troubles. Finally, my lack of sleep caught up with me. I woke up with Scott gently nudging me awake. I stumbled into bed and slept 10 hours. That morning we divided up some of his clothes so I would have enough to wear. He hadn't dropped off any of his laundry for the week, so I decided to do a couple of loads. I had an old washer and dryer at my place, which Scott kept in excellent condition and which I used frequently. His utility room contained 2 gleaming units fit to do the work of a family of 10. He rarely used them. Early in our relationship, he did a load of our wash together. My underwear came out pink. This I could forgive, but the next week he shrank 3 of my favorite sweatshirts to unwearability. I read the paper, drank coffee, and monitored the tumbling clothes. He thumbed through art catalogs, occasionally showing me paintings and asking my opinion. This was one of his methods of finding out what he could get me for Christmas. I didn't let on that I suspected this and make sure I expressed extreme liking for my favorite ones. A little after noon Sunday, we drove out to River's Edge. We had an appointment with Daniels and Johnson at 1. Daniels greeted us with, What the hell did you guys do to the Bluefield kid? He pressing charges? I asked. For what? Daniels asked. What did the kid say? Scott asked. Daniels said, The kid retracted what he said about seeing you, Mason, in the quarter the night of the murder. Said he lied. We were not nice to him about that, by the way, but he looked a little the worse for wear. That social worker showed up. Dalrymple? We left him in her hands. Mom and Dad still in jail? Scott asked. Got bailed out early this morning. What? I said. Drug money can cover a multitude of sins, Daniel said. Obviously these two have some connections. The captain told me some fancy lawyer got here an hour after we arrested them. They made bail early this morning. We had to let them go. A few minutes later, we were back on the topic of the murder. You're still on the front burner on the stove of suspects, but it's not quite as hot as it was. Still, Daniel shook his head. What can you tell us about the investigation? I asked, not expecting much of an answer, but he told us more than I thought he would. We're pretty sure the knife came from the school cafeteria, Daniel said. We checked the brand, and it matches the kind they have. Most of the other knives we examined were fairly blunt. This one had been honed. Somebody planned to kill Jones. He told us that nothing in Jones's office had been disturbed, that Jones hadn't been robbed, that according to a careful examination by Carolyn Blackburn and Georgette Constantine, nothing was missing or out of place. Neighbors and friends said the Joneses were a good couple, fought perhaps a little less than most. No evidence of extramarital affairs, no abuse, no alcohol, no money problems. Daniels concluded, usually in these cases you count the wife as a major suspect, but this seems almost definitely connected with school. We nodded agreement. Daniel said, we haven't been able to dig up many problems at school. I thought most administrators were assholes. From the way the faculty talked, the guy was a saint. He was a good administrator, I said. We just had disagreements once in a while. Daniel said, we checked with your buddy Kirk Campbell to see if there'd been any particular union problems. Nothing out of the ordinary. We did talk to Al Willman, since you and he met with Jones on that grievance, but the old man claims he doesn't know anything. I hesitated to tell Daniels all we knew. I was still ticked off about the way he and his partner had been treating us. We finished up at the police station, and in the truck, Scott said, now what? I said, do you know what's odd? I didn't wait for him to answer. None of our suspects has an alibi for the time the murder could have been committed, but they all have great alibis for burning down the house. So none of them did it, Scott said. Or somebody's doing a good cover-up. I'm pretty convinced Bluefield didn't do it, I said. Bluefield dad or kid? Scott asked. And are we talking about murder or arson? Arson. They killed. Wait! If the kid didn't burn it, why not the dad? I explained my reasoning to Scott. The guy hated me. The kid had to get his homophobia from somewhere, obviously at home, where the idea could be cemented into his head. We didn't ask the father where he was the night of the fire. We are not going over to the house to beat him up and get him to confess. Not after yesterday, Scott said. I didn't contradict that statement. Mr. Bluefield would have to come up with an alibi for Friday night at a later time. What about Mr. Bluefield as a murder suspect? I asked. No motive, Scott said, but if Bluefield or one of the murder suspects burned the house, we're still in danger. Bluefield's got to be pretty pissed at us for busting up his drug concession. I nodded agreement. Bluefield could be a big problem. We drove toward my place to get Scott's car. Halfway there, Scott said, I hope this weather holds. It was another gorgeous day. I said, I hope we aren't too late to get the color up at the cabin. He murmured agreement. Motive, I said as we pulled into my driveway. I had a hard time looking at the charred remains. We've got to find out why somebody would kill him. Let's go to the school, I said. We are not breaking in, Scott said. Who said anything about breaking in? They let one of the local churches use it for Sunday school classes. We shall simply walk in, and clues will leap out at us. I want to look around George's office if I can. Maybe I'll be able to spot something of significance the police missed. Scott gave an audible sigh of resignation. I chose to ignore it. He pulled up to the school as the congregation began to filter out the doors. We found Georgette, Caroline Blackburn, and one of the assistant principals, Edwina Jenkins, in the principal's office. They looked startled to see us. What are you doing here? Georgette asked. We told them about the latest developments with the Bluefields. Carolyn said, Edwina is taking over as acting principal tomorrow. We needed to organize a few things. Edwina wore thick black horn-rimmed glasses. She'd been a physics teacher for 10 years and then went back to get her administrative certification. She'd been one of the assistant principals for the past 3 years. We chatted for a short while, then walked out of the office. Georgette followed us. She said to Scott, I didn't want to make a scene in there, but I know you're Scott Carpenter, the baseball player. I got to as many games as I can in the summer. I love watching you pitch. I never thought I'd meet you. I'd heard you and Mr. Mason knew one another. I hardly believed it. She did her most scatterbrained twitter and giggle act until she got to the part about wanting specific autographs and specific souvenirs for specific grandchildren. Carolyn and Edwina left a few minutes later. Carolyn said to Georgette, Before you leave, be sure to remind Mr. Longfellow that you're gone. That way he won't waste time wondering if you're still here. They left. Longfellow works on Sundays? I asked. If you can call it work, Georgette said. I'll look for him and he'll be drunk in some corner. I don't tell on him because it's not my business. None of the custodians likes to come in on Sundays, but Longfellow is in trouble because of the other day when you found him asleep. I think they're going to make him go to an alcoholic rehabilitation clinic. She leaned closer to us and whispered, I hear if that doesn't sober him up, they're going to fire him. I don't trust him. I wish they'd fired him years ago. I said, Georgette, you could do us a big favor. I promise to help you any way I can. And now with your house burned down, anything I can do to help. This is pretty serious, Georgette. You don't have to do it if you don't want, and I don't blame you if you get angry at me for asking, but it really might help. Georgette said, I can never be angry at you, Mr. Mason. I know many principals keep an active file on all the teachers in their building. The police might not be aware of it because it was held separate from the official file kept in the district office. I explained to Georgette that I wanted to look in the active teachers' files. She didn't respond for a minute, and I thought I was out of luck. Then she said, If Mr. Carpenter had some souvenirs in his car, we could run out and get them. You could wait here, Mr. Mason. Perhaps even waiting next to that cabinet over there might be more comfortable. She pointed to a file drawer across the room. She paused at the door to the office. I guess I won't need my purse just walking out to Mr. Carpenter's car. She tossed it on her desk, linked her arm in Scott's, propelled him out the door. She was already twittering at a hummingbird's pace. For a few seconds I listened to her receding voice and their departing footsteps. Then I hurried to the cabinet, locked. Then I realized why Georgette had so elaborately left her purse. I grabbed the keys out of it. Moments later, I had the file drawer open. I checked the files of the people we talked to, and all of them I found notes that Jones had made about each of their problems. Donna Dalrymple had been caught with Bluefield not once, but twice. I wondered why Jones hadn't simply fired her outright. Al Wellman hadn't been completely honest with me. Either Jones had a list of infractions Al had committed for the past 6 months of school. Next to each problem, Jones had listed the date, the time, and what directive he'd given Wellman. Old Al hadn't been a good boy. Jones had listed all of his failures to comply with rules, attendance, forms not completed, grades turned in late, lesson plans inadequately prepared, and on and on. Al had told me about less than half of them. It's not nice to keep information back from your union rep. Could turn him or her into a fool at meetings with administrators, or worse, maybe lose your case because the union rep didn't have all the information. Amazingly enough, in more than half the teacher complaints I've had to handle, the teachers have left out something vital, something they're ashamed of or embarrassed about. Can't blame them, really. Reputation can be central to a person's life. Our Marshall Longfellow, Jones had caught him in the school basement numerous mornings, sleeping off the effects of alcohol. The guy had gotten drunk at school and never gone home. I was surprised to find extensive notes on Clarissa Hartwig. The student teacher had even more to discover, that he thought she was totally incompetent and would make an awful teacher. I wonder if he told her or the professors at Lincoln University. A report like that could easily endanger her whole career. Before reaching for the next file, I took a quick glance into the hallway. I didn't want Marshall Longfellow accidentally being competent enough to catch me, and I didn't know how long Scott and Georgette would be gone. She was being kind enough to help. I didn't want her to get in trouble if I got caught. I assumed they were doing their best to give me time. As I rifled through the next file, another concern resurfaced. Maybe the killer was someone from outside the school, to whom we would have no clue, or perhaps one of the other teachers who had problems with him that I didn't know about. I didn't have the time to hunt through all the personnel files. I'd have to stick with Meg's information from the day before, that none of the other school personnel had a motive for murder. In Max Younger's file, I found that the David Mamet of the Grover Cleveland Theater Department had directed promising graduates to a shady talent agency in Chicago. Jones had several notes about getting runarounds when he called them. He'd planned to visit them next week. Fiona Wilson, clothes horse woman about town, physics genius, and computer wizard, had offered Jones delights beyond his wildest imaginings while trying to sit on his lap in his office chair. Jones had been harassing Denise Flowers. The untenured Mrs. Flowers had been observed up to 4 or 5 times a week in all of her different classes, and in each one Jones had found flaws, some of which were preparing lessons poorly, making silly threats of discipline, coming to class late, and glossing over difficult material. I pulled the file drawer all the way out. When I first opened it, at the very back was a piece of paper sitting alone and unfiled. I pulled it out, part of a much larger memo. It started in the middle of a sentence. It was the documentation on Dan Bluefield, including a list of dates and times when Jones had met with the boy or the father, or both, after each date with an anecdotal record. I hunted quickly for the rest of the documents. I heard footsteps coming down the hall. I kept the Bluefield information stuffed the last folder into its alphabetical place, shut and locked the file drawer, and returned the keys to the purse. Scott and Georgette walked in smiling a moment later. Georgette took her purse and got ready to leave. I told her that we wanted to interview Marshall Longfellow, so she didn't have to go looking for him. In the hall, after Georgette left, Scott said, "I like her. She's sort of like Meg, only on fast forward. A lot of common sense there. Did you find anything?" I told him. "Another round of interviews would seem to be in order," he said. I agreed. He examined the Bluefield document briefly. "I don't understand its significance," Scott said. "I'm not sure there is any," I said, "but I'd like to know where the rest of it is, and I'd like to know what it said. If he was keeping notes on Bluefield, maybe it meant he was going to take action. Maybe he wasn't as big a buddy as Dan thought." Scott glanced at the notes again. "I don't think this was stuff against the kid," he said. He pointed to the names. "It's about Bluefield Sr. Mostly, not the kid." "He was after Mr. Bluefield?" I asked. Scott shrugged. "We could try to check it out, but I can't imagine Bluefield succumbing to our normally irresistible charms. We found Marshal Longfellow without too much trouble. He was sitting with his back to us in a rusting folding chair on top of the gym roof. I checked there after looking in the heating air conditioning room. I discovered him on Thursday. He sat far enough away from the edge of the roof so he wouldn't be seen from below, but close enough so he could see all the vista. Walking toward him, I saw that from this angle, River's Edge looked almost like a peaceful New England town on the ripe edge of fall. Closer to his chair, I noted 5 or 6 empty beer cans scattered around him. He'd forgotten his resolve in less than 2 days. I figured he'd passed out in his drunken state and wasn't moving for that reason. I was wrong. He wasn't moving because he was dead. Everybody showed up, the cops, Daniels, and Johnson, the school personnel led by Carolyn Blackburn, and the school board president, reporters lurking in the background. The police interviewed us separately and together. Except for making sure he was dead, we hadn't touched anything. How'd he die? I asked. We hadn't been able to see any obvious wounds. They don't know yet, Daniel said. Could be natural causes, but this is another coincidence, and like I said the other day, I don't believe in them. 2 deaths in 5 days in the same school. Your house burned down. Something is definitely screwy. In their questioning, Daniels and Johnson were polite and correct, but they gave me no reason to trust them or confide in them. Before we left, we talked to Carolyn and the school board president, Jessica Allen. Carolyn said, "This is sick. The guy wasn't the greatest custodian on earth, but still." Allen nodded agreement. She asked, "Are you all right, Mr. Mason? I realize this has been a tough time for you and your friend." She hadn't done a recognition dance after being introduced to Scott. "As well as could be expected," I said, and thanked her for asking. "Who else was around today?" That congregation," Carolyn said. "They'll probably have their own church by next summer. I can't wait. It'll be less of a problem all around. No setting up chairs in the gym, no keeping a custodian on duty." "I meant, were there any school personnel on duty besides Marshal Longfellow?" I asked. Carolyn said, "I'd have to check the records. In fact, the police asked me too, but as far as I remember, Marshal was it." "Do you think it was murder?" Jessica Allen asked. She was an attractive, intelligent-looking woman, perhaps in her middle 40s. "I don't know," I said. I didn't want to get into a discussion of murder suspects. A few minutes later, we left. As we sat in the truck, Scott said, "This is a revolting development." I reached over and mussed his hair. "I could use some ideals, not age-old cliches." "Okay, if it's murder, who profits from Longfellow's death? So far, we've got lots of people who benefit from Jones's murder." "Good question. About Longfellow, we don't know anything about his private life," I said. "If he was murdered, it could be for reasons totally unrelated to school. Or he saw something that day, and he got killed for what he knew," Scott said. "Also possible," I said. "For now, the police will check into all that background stuff on him. Maybe Daniels can tell us some later, including how he died. It might not be murder." We decided to pursue the information contained in the files. Donna Dalrymple slammed her door in our faces. Next, we tried Al Wellman. His excuse for not telling me all the nasty things Jones accused him of was, "I forgot." It is said that the longer people teach, the more they become like the kids in the grade level they deal with, but this was a bit much. He stuck to that excuse. I found myself shouting at him at one point. He had tears in his eyes as he responded, "Don't yell at me. You're one of my few friends. Please stop." As soon as he said it, I felt rotten for yelling at the poor old guy. We weren't that close. If I was one of his few friends, what must the rest of his life be like? We told him about Longfellow. He seemed genuinely shocked. Without prompting it, Al told us he'd been home alone all afternoon working on the Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle. At the student-teacher's house, Ralph Hartwig let us in. He told us he expected Clarissa back any minute from shopping at Orland Square. She had been gone since 11 in the morning, plenty of time to get to school to do murder. We talked baseball for 15 minutes before the front door opened. Clarissa walked in without any packages. She saw us and threw her keys across the room. She shook her finger at Ralph and yelled, "I told you if they came back, you were not to let them in." Ralph looked petrified and put upon. He mumbled, "They're only trying to help." I said, "Marshal Longfellow is dead." That stopped her onslaught for a moment. "Who is he?" Clarissa asked. I explained. "And you came here to find out if I killed him?" she accused. "No," I said. "We came here to find out if Jones had turned in any reports on you to the university." Abruptly, she flopped onto an ottoman. He told me he was going to tell my professor at Lincoln University. Jones came in to observe my classes before I was ready. He'd sit there writing for the entire class period. I got so nervous I forgot kids' names, what I was doing, what questions to ask, what homework to assign. It was chaos. What was he going to tell? I asked. I didn't kill him, she said. He hadn't done it yet, Scott said. She gazed at him for a moment, then lowered her head and shook it. She spoke toward the carpet. He told me he was going to do it this week. Are you going to tell the police? No, Scott said. We found out she'd had an interview with Jones only a few minutes before I'd come upon her with Bluefield in the science room. Ralph said, I appreciate your not telling the police. Clarissa's had it rough. She's wanted to be a teacher for a long time. He just wasn't fair to her. He never gave her a chance. We left. Max Younger wasn't home. Fiona Wilson met us at the door in a filmy negligee. Strange wear, I thought, for a Sunday afternoon, but then there were days when Scott and I walked around the house all day in our jockey shorts. Those are often my favorite days. After she invited us in, Fiona asked if we wanted to accompany her to her bedroom while she slipped into something more appropriate for visiting. She cast many covetous glances at Scott. He didn't seem to notice. He walked over to the top of the television set, picked up a photo in a frame, and asked her, Who are these people? No one you know, she said, and disappeared down the hallway. I joined Scott. The picture was of Fiona and with what could easily have been a husband or boyfriend. A golden retriever sat in front of them. The picture had been taken in this room. Fiona's house was typical of the vast majority of the newer section of River's Edge, one of 4 types of tract houses offered by a builder, with the family room downstairs, kitchen, dining room, and living room on the ground floor, and bedroom upstairs. Fiona came back down in a bright pink sweatsuit. Scott and I sat on the couch in the living room. Fiona sat in a purple plush armchair. She swung her legs over the side, put her arms behind her, and threw her head back. I wondered if she desired the effect, which was to emphasize the considerable heft of her breast. She'd picked the wrong crowd to play for. I said, Fiona, what did Robert Jones do when you came on to him in his office? She looked startled for only an instant, then slowly ran her bright red fingernails up her thigh and over her abdomen, stopping just short of her ample chest endowment. She said, Like all men, he was interested. I enjoy sex, and when he came on to me, I figured why not? I can't imagine how you found out, but it's your word against mine. He'd be in as much trouble, more even for coming on to me, so you can take your shady suspicions and shove them up your ass. She delivered this last line with casual defiance. Was he blackmailing you? I asked. The thought had struck me that with all this negative information about people, Jones might have delved into the monetary possibilities. I didn't think it was much of a theory, but I wanted to check it out. Fiona uncoiled herself sufficiently so that her feet touched the floor. Blackmail? She mused. No, he knew a few things about me, but everybody knows I like sex. It's not a secret. I didn't know, I said. It's not for lack of trying. I looked confused. She said, I've come on to you numerous times. You were too naive or too... She stopped a moment, then pointed at Scott. You guys are lovers. You're gay. No wonder you never noticed. She sat back with her arms crossed over her chest. That explains a lot. We asked where she'd been that day. She told us she'd been home alone. A few minutes later, we left, little the wiser for our visit. Dennis Flowers lived in a condo development in River's Edge, just south of 167th Street. The area was starkly devoid of trees, and the smoothed-out dirt where lawns belonged testified to the newness of the development. Denise Flowers greeted us with, Can't you leave me alone? I told her about Marshall Longfellow. She said, The guy who looks like Santa Claus. He's dead. I nodded. Why would somebody kill him? She asked. We aren't sure it was murder, I said. I did find out that Jones was constantly observing you in your classroom and that you weren't going to get tenure this year. I want to be left alone, she said. I don't want to talk about it. I could have been out of a job. I said, I'm not trying to bring you trouble, Denise. I'm trying to find out who killed Jones. I'm sorry you were having trouble with him. If you could answer some questions, it might really help. 10 minutes later, after a lot of cajoling and convincing, she agreed to talk. She said, "He told me that there were problems, but he claimed I had time to correct them. What I was doing wrong in the classroom. The only thing I ever really did wrong was make him mad at me." I asked her to explain. The year before, besides her regular classes and cheerleading duties, he'd asked her to take on extra duties to help put out the school newspaper and yearbook. At first, she had refused. He told me that I didn't have a choice, that it was a condition of my employment, and that I had to do it. This was probably true. It's often difficult to get teachers to do extra work, so many school districts make it part of the deal in hiring you. The interviewer asks a prospective teacher if he or she is willing to do extra duties. The job seeker, willing to agree to almost anything to get the position, readily acquiesces. Later, this comes back to haunt the new teacher, who is forced to do enormous quantities of work for meager pay. Denise said, "I'm afraid I got a little snotty with him. I apologized later, but I think even then it was too late. He decided to get rid of me no matter what I did." "Was he trying to blackmail you?" I asked. She looked startled. "No, I haven't got enough money to make it worthwhile for him to ask me for any." "How did you afford this condo?" I asked. "In the south suburbs, the price of condos was out of control. Must be in a place that had to be worth well over $175,000. "I borrowed from my parents," she said. "You need a job to keep up the payments." "A fairly good one," I said. "That's not your business," she snapped. "It is if you were desperate enough to kill him to keep your job." "He'd have passed his notes on to someone," she said. "I'd have tried to destroy the notes, wouldn't I? His documentation on me was devastating." "Maybe not, if his main reason for getting you fired was that he didn't like you," I said. She shook her head. "He had enough stuff written down. I couldn't have done a thing about it." In the car, Scott said, "I think she's off the list." I still wasn't convinced, although she wasn't near the top of my crowd of likely killers. I picked the Bluefield document out of the glove compartment, where I'd stuffed it after the confusion of Marshall Longfellow's death. "This has got to mean something," I said. "Let's go talk to Bluefield." A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.